University of Montana Western. I work with Justin here in Montana. And I've been working for about the last decade with tribal colleges to provide teacher preparation for Indigenous teacher candidates and then prepare them to work within their communities. So the projects that I've been involved in are partnerships between the tribal colleges, University of Montana Western, and the local public schools to address chronic and severe teacher shortages, both in rural Montana as well as in tribal communities. And we've done that by taking our programs to the communities and working closely with the school districts who actually deliver our coursework. And I would just say that the majority of our students are Indigenous, and they also come from within the community. And so we know that they will stay in the community because it's their home and because they have a commitment to work with the children within their community. And so we have some good results, and I'd be happy to share some of those outcomes and some of the features of our model that we think have been particularly effective.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, all three of you, for joining this discussion. I've been looking forward to this. So first question that I'll pose to all of you. I think that we've heard a lot of discussion of recognition of learning and the some of the technical requirements that go along with that. A lot of discussion of standards. We're lucky to have your perspective because it seems to me that much of your work and expertise that you bring is you've also seen and worked in the more of the organizational side of it, more of the human challenge of how do we reach out and build partnerships across organizations? How do we recognize value from one organization to another and make sure that all stakeholders are kind of getting what they want out of it. So my question to all of you is, I guess start off with a very broad question is, I'm interested in your insights and your kind of 30,000 view of what is important for organizations who are wanting to make this step, organizations who are wanting to reach out, form partnerships, and co-recognize learning with another organization. What do they have to do? What advice would you have for them? And whoever would like to start. I think Lena, would you like to take that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take that one first. I mean, I think there are three really unique perspectives on this panel. I work at a systemic level, Anne works at an institutional level, and Vikki works in between community and the institution. And so there's all different kinds of levels of localization here on display. So yeah, thanks Justin. And I was so interested in the previous conversation that we were just having because you know, at eCampusOntario, we have a teacher kind of professional development program, and there's a technologist module in that program. And the core principle of the technologist module is that you start with the learning challenge and then you choose the technology. So I think this conversation of what comes first, or do they come at the same time, the people and the technology, or the culture change and the technology, and which is in the driver's seat at any given time, is a really interesting one, and one that we should explore further. At eCampusOntario, one of the things that we have really intentionally done is we have incentivized the building of relationships. So we have a micro-credential pilot program, which has been running for 2 years now. And we have been giving very small pockets of money, but money nonetheless, to our educational institutions to incent the development of a partnership. And we have not specified in that process anything about technology, because we have recognized really early on that it's going to take a collaborative effort between an educational institution and whoever is on the other side of that kind of skills recognition effort, right? Whether it be an Indigenous community, whether it be a big for-profit employer, whether it be a healthcare provider, whether it be a municipality, whoever is on the other end of that, in the receiving end of that credential or that piece of recognition, is going to have some really important things to say about how it is created. And so what we did is we created a space where institutions had to submit to us, you know, a letter from that employer saying, yes, I recognize that this is a skills gap. Yes, I am fully ready to engage with this educational provider to co-create this curriculum. And we really believe that it's through that collaboration and the co-creation of that curriculum that you get the best product. And we've seen that kind of the pilots that have the best relationship and have built the relationship over time, sat around the table, talked about really clearly what it is that they're valuing in this process. Those are the pilots that really were super successful. And the other thing that has happened because of that approach is there have been new approaches that have come forward that I couldn't have anticipated when we first set out. And so I really think it's so critical to support people in that process and to leave the door open for innovative and different approaches to skills recognition, which, you know, like some of the previous panelists recognized, are not always accounted for in the technology that we are using, right? So I think that that we're in a really interesting place right now in terms of, you know, maybe the people and the culture shift is starting to catch up with the technology, but it's really important that those providers be responsive and be looking back to the community to say, what makes sense to you? How are you currently using this? What do you want to achieve? And I think that where we will end up will be something that is much more meaningful and authentic for the people on the ground.
That's one of the things, as I mentioned in our previous call, one of the things that interested me about eCampus's approach was not taking the approach of so many who build micro-credential systems of let's build a micro-credential system and then offer it to the world and hope that others see value in it. What happens when we start with that value proposition from the get-go as the very first step? Anne, can I pass along the same question to you, because University of Waterloo has a tremendous depth of experience when it comes to developing these partnerships between organizations.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, what advice do you have?
So I think when it comes to establishing relationships with industry and community partners, we're starting one step back. So we're not even looking at skills recognition yet. We're wanting to understand expectations of the industry and community partner for reaching out to us, as well as the expectations for the academic program. And that's sort of the fundamental starting point, is to understand what each of the stakeholders is hoping to get out of that mutual engagement together. And then thinking about the structures that need to be put in place to establish the reciprocity. And that's always core to when we talk about work integrated learning. We can't expect our employers to take students into the workplace unless they're seeing the return on investment, the outcomes achieved that they're hoping to. At the same time, our students go into the workplace as learners. And so, yes, they're contributing to the organization's bottom line, but there's also an expectation that they're growing and learning as as individuals. And so that to me is always the fascinating question as we reach out and we attempt to build these relationships, is to be able to develop the common language such that you can understand each other's expectations, understand the barriers for each of the participant that might inhibit their ability to actually meet their expectations. So, if you take the example of a startup, they might want to bring students into the workplace because they've got a lot of immediate project work that needs to be done. And then the question is really, do they have the structures and the supports in place for those students such that the students will be able to deliver their best performance? So always kind of thinking about learning as much as we can about the other organization, and then where that sort of distills down into skills recognition is being able to clearly articulate the kinds of skills that an employer or a community partner could expect that the student would bring into the workplace, such that we're talking about assessing or recognizing those skills at an appropriate level. And just to give you one really quick example, we have a student performance evaluation that the employer completes at the end of the work term to assess the student on 16 different competencies. And there's no clear reference point for that student performance evaluation. And so the question is the employer assessing the student compared to a full-time employee, compared to an entry-level employee, compared to the other students that they have in the workplace? All of those, that sort of lack of clarity is going to dramatically affect how we talk about the skill development and the extent to which we're willing to recognize it.
That's fascinating. So I one of the points that I wrote down in my notebook here was I think it's interesting when you say you're taking a step back, right? Like the starting place for you isn't so much the skills that you're co-recognizing, it's the value, right? And the aims maybe of each organization and the different stakeholders.
That's
Terrific.
exactly it. The exact language that we would use too, Justin. So good job.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. All right. I have YouTube. I've watched some of your presentations. So Vikki, I think you covered a little bit of this in your introduction, but I think just same question to you is the what advice would you have for forming these relationships across organizations? And I think as we talked about in the call in our previous call, in some ways you had the challenge of not only forming relationships with other organizations, but there are possible, barriers of trust too between organizations in the work that you had and the challenges that you had. So maybe, I don't know, maybe what advice would you give to folks who wanted to do something similar to what you've done?
So thank you for that question, Justin. And thinking about Lena's response and Anne-Marie's response, I would say that our project is a lot looser and that we have MOAs in place. And but the projects that I've been involved with start with these communities coming to us with a need. And so basal requirement is the establishment of a relationship and the reciprocity of, if this school district provides opportunities for our students to do their work, and the community college provides the associate's degree, and we provide the bachelor's degree. But we have to really, we have more of a human relationship because I visit, I basically live in these communities, and I visit the schools, and I go to our students' classrooms, and I meet with the principals. And so here's an example of the how that helps us. We usually place all of our student teachers. We start out in September, and by December, we hope that all of our students get placed in the schools where they have made the request. Last week, I called the principals in one of the communities one day, and by the end of the day, I had all of the students placed. And so that happened because over the years, we have learned to trust each other, and we have learned to give when a request was asked of us. And so it's the fact that we know that all of the pieces of this program, who's responsible for those pieces, and that we can depend on each other to make the pieces come together. So I would say, for our project, it's that human connection has been essential. And I can say that for each of the communities in which I've had an opportunity to work. Same thing with the community college. When we first started our project up in Browning, the superintendent of schools came to a meeting when we were recruiting students, and that was the first time in decades that anyone from the schools had ever been to the community college. And they're 3 blocks away from each other. So, so it's that bringing together of human needs and potentials, and developing those relationships. Very labor intensive.
Justin, can I just jump in on reacting to Vikki?
Please do.
I just think it's so interesting because in the previous panel, the question of where does trust come from came up. And I think, what Vikki just described is that it comes through relationships between people. So, my first piece of advice, which was invest in people, is really also just more about invest in their relationship building process. And I just want to add on to that the other way, if you're at a system level that you can, or even at any level, honestly, that you want to build trust within a community, is to co-create your values and principles. So eCampusOntario built a 1-page framework. And I shouldn't say we built it, because we actually co-created it with a whole bunch of educators and a whole bunch of employers. It was an open process. Anybody was free to come and share. But it was kind of the coming together of 2 different groups with 2 different perspectives. And government was there too, I should add. So 3 different groups with 3 different perspectives to kind of shape something together that was a future that they wanted to see. And it started with the principles. What's driving us? Relevance is really important. Ownership of the credential is really important to us. Evidence, although now maybe I should be updating it to say documentation, is important to us. But that act of doing that as a community is really simple, but it gets everybody on the same page and going forward with a shared understanding of what it is that you're trying to do with this work, where it is that your efforts are going. And I think that Vikki did that, at a local level with people over time. But if there is money available, if it's coming from governments, if it's coming from other bodies, I really think that it is extremely valuable investment to put towards some sort of a process like that, because it pays dividends going forward and is the thing that you then make decisions about technology based on. So that's actually what we did. We had our principles and framework, and that was what we used to make a decision about technology. It wasn't the technology first. It was, what do we want to do?
And see, Vikki, perfect question. Lena, I was just going to ask the same thing. Vikki, you initially created these partnerships between between Western and Blackfeet Community College, but it's since expanded. Was that initial relationship with the Blackfeet Community College, was that did that pave the way for partnerships with like Little Bighorn College?
Yes, absolutely. So I just want to follow up a little bit on Lena's comment about shared values and then respond to that question, Justin. So one of the things we did going into the project was to value the school curriculum and the expertise within the community, as well as Indigenous pedagogy and ways of knowing. And so our model has been to recruit faculty from the schools, the instructional leaders, the principals, actually teach our Western classes in the community. They introduce our students to the curriculum within the schools, so they already have an opportunity to learn how to teach math using the math curriculum in the schools. And more importantly, then the baseline curriculum is based on cultural values. So all of those conversations have been husbanded throughout the project. And then, so we have our superintendent of schools in Browning, Blackfeet schools, talking about our project in Washington, DC. And then the Little Bighorn College and the community came to us and said, hey, we want this in our community. So we have replicated a project with the Crow Nation, and basically the same model with different modifications. But yes, so the word is out in the state, and we're now working with 5 different tribal colleges across the state.
So question about, again, about just shifting gears here just a little bit, actually, to the more of a work integrated learning question. So Vikki, a lot of your work could be considered work integrated learning, certainly. And Waterloo is well known for work integrated learning. Yeah, I'm curious, just what are the resources, what are the supports that are needed to support this this work integrated learning? I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. That question is directed to you first.
Absolutely. So I think you can think of it very broadly in terms of the structures that you would need to put in place in order to be able to build those relationships with employer and community partners and send students out. But I tend to think about it with the actual integration component as a little more prominent, because I think that's the more difficult piece to do. So, here in Canada, we're really fortunate to have a lot of government wage subsidies to encourage students, youth to have employment, whether that's a part of their academic program or not. And to me, the difference in the learning experience really boils down to how well we do that integration piece. So that's how well we prepare the students to go out into the workplace. That's a differentiator between a WIL experience and a summer job. How well we support them when they're out on that experience, and then how we bring them back into our campuses and how we help them reflect on what they learned and extract the most value from that. And I think this is a really critical piece to consider. I always remember this study I read that was looking at, I think it was education, social work, and physiotherapy students, and they were out on their first internship. And they were asking them about the connections that they made between their academic program and what they were doing in those internships. And they weren't able to make the connections at all, because for these students, it was all about adjusting into being an employee, to figuring out organizational politics and getting to work on time and getting their laundry done and feeding themselves and all of those other things. And so So to imagine that we can just sort of send students back and forth between school and work and not put those structures in place to help them realize that success in the workplace is very different than success in school, and then to support them as they go through those challenges. If we really want them to be able to make the connections between their workplace learning and their academic learning, that infrastructure has to be there. At Waterloo, we're fortunate enough to have a program that my team runs that is a curriculum for the students while they're out on their work terms, that is constantly giving them those reflective prompts to think about how their experiences in the workplace may connect in with what they did learn in the classroom or where they want to go in their careers. And I think it's an integral component to the whole structure.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's because yeah, it resonates with me. So we ran a pilot at Western on recognition of 21st century skills in a student internship, and one of our big takeaways was that the things that we thought students would, kind of the foundational knowledge that we thought they would have, simply the ability to recognize for themselves, when am I demonstrating teamwork skills? Or in these interactions that I've had, what's an example where I've communicated well? Turned out to be incredibly difficult for students. And we were actually really surprised by that, how difficult it was for students to just kind of have that metacognition, that reflection of their own skills.
Yeah, and I think it runs the gamut. I think it runs the gamut from transferable skills to technical skills. I'll never forget one of our career counselors telling me a story that she was doing a mock interview with a student, and their program of study was financial analysis and risk management. So they went through a couple of introductory questions, and then the career counselor said, "Tell me about a time when you used data to prove a point." This was a third-year student, so they'd been in university for 3 years. They'd had multiple work terms, presumably using their financial analysis and risk management skills, which would involve a whole lot of data, and they weren't able to make that connection. And it's not that they didn't know, it's just that they didn't connect. And I think that this feeds into the much larger conversation about skills recognition and transferability of skills throughout our lives. I think one of the most fundamental things that we can do is teach our students how to recognize their skills, how to self-assess, how to recognize the areas of development, and to be able to tell their story to employers. And there is the connection into open badges and a whole lot of what we've been talking about today.
And please, by all means, don't, if you want to don't wait for me to ask questions, because I think that all of you could ask better questions than what I could ask. So, don't wait for me. Please feel free to chime in. But you're right, that is a great connection between what we've been discussing today. And I can't help but think what does that mean for our visions of open recognition, right? Where we are trying to give people the, enable people to have their skills recognized. And maybe there is an underlying assumption that is easier for people to do than perhaps what it really is, just recognizing that the skills and the experiences they've had in their lives.
I think, Justin, that one of the things that that I see as a really kind of no-brainer connection between digital recognition and work integrated learning is kind of gets a little bit of what Anne is talking about, which is just that the intentionality that is involved with the digital recognition is an important step to making sure that those connections that Anne is referring to are made. So one of the things that that we found with a lot of our pilots is that a lot of our teams that had assembled were assembling around something that already existed, was already work that they were doing, But it needed to be, once they had decided to make it into a micro-credential pilot, they just had a couple more steps to go to actually make it intentional enough that they were ready to put it on the internet. Like there is something really substantial that happens when you say, okay, now this is a thing that's going to be a record online, that's going to mean something to some people, that's going to be endorsed by these other partners, and that is co-created with these people. It kind of pushes everybody, students, educators, it pushes everybody just those couple of more steps towards, I think, bridging that gap that Anne is describing, which is not just that you go and you do your work integrated learning thing and you are in the office and you've got your seat time, but that you actually transfer that into some intentional learning, and you are forced through whatever assessment mechanism is attached to that piece of recognition to do some sort of work to indicate that that learning has taken place. And I think that, so I see work integrated learning and micro-credentialing as being, tied at the hip, and the act of issuing a micro-credential for a piece of work integrated learning as being kind of that final leg of the race that might help the learner articulate what it is that they've learned, and also, frankly, will help the employer become a little bit more intentional about what it is that they're trying to help these learners achieve. It's not just that you're getting me coffee, it's that I actually have to put some thought into this. Okay, I need a plan, that uses data in order to assess the risk in my organization. I've actually done some thinking into that, not just, okay, I've got some interns, they've come in and I've checked a box.
So on that topic of checking a box, I'm curious, in your experience, that's it. My experience in this realm is minuscule compared to yours, but in what little forays I've had, the prevalence of that, how do you overcome that checking a box approach to this kind of work is really challenging. So I'm curious, what insights you have.
We were and you were talking about that when we last talked about how, there's a significant amount in Canada right now. There's a lot of money going into this. And the outcome is just numbers, right? It's just number of work integrated learning opportunities that have happened. And, we'll get thousands or hundreds of thousands. I don't know, Anne, you would know the numbers better than me. But what does that really mean? And where is that real value? So I think it's absolutely incumbent on governments and absolutely incumbent on organizations that influence governments or advocate to governments to tie meaningful requirements to funding. So, one of the things that we did in our program, like I described earlier, is that we required a letter from the employer. So what could have happened is that we could have put a whole bunch of money out into the higher education system. A whole bunch of educators could have said, okay, I have this like 2 courses. I'm just going to make them a micro credential, and then I'm going to say I did it and move on. But by requiring, it wasn't even like it was just an extra work. You've got to go out into your community. You have to find an employer that's interested in partnering with you. You have to build a relationship with them enough that they're prepared to write you a letter that says, yes, this matters to me. Yes, I want to contribute this. They have to be important to you enough that they, like Anne's partner, attend an event alongside you and co-present your findings of your work. So I think it's all in what you require in exchange for the investment dollars that are going out the door. And there's all sorts of creative ways that you can rethink application processes and funding requirements that tip the scales and kind of find that good balance of carrots over sticks that really help people achieve something greater than they even thought they would achieve when they were preparing their application to go into it.
Can I jump in for a second? And then I feel like I really have to pass this to Vikki because I'm sure she's got a million really rich things to say on this as well. So in the late 70s in Canada, we set a series of accreditation criteria for co-op programs. And anyone who knows me is really annoyed with me talking about the value of these accreditation criteria, because I never thought I would be a person that would hold to rules as having so much value, but I really do. So in the late 70s, the guidelines that were set for co-op work terms in Canada involved a number of criteria, and they are criteria that require partnerships, co-creation, and skin in the game for both partners. And I think they are absolutely critical to us having a really robust WIL ecosystem. So for example, students have to be paid. It is a requirement that if you are going to have a co-op student, you have to pay them, and that's a national standard. And so that has meant that employers, and there's been studies that have been done that show that employers require more of their students when they're paying them money. They're going to give them more meaningful work because they're expending income to have the students come in. There's also accreditation criteria that says that the position has to be jointly developed between the institution and the employer, and the student has to be doing meaningful work. So they can't just be observing, they have to be contributing. On the flip side, one of the accreditation criteria that was set says that students have to be available year-round. That is an incredibly difficult criteria for post-secondary institutions to meet. At my institution, it means we have to teach every course twice. But what it means for the employers is that there is a steady stream of student talent that they can call upon, regardless of season. So you don't have this issue of the summer student. And I'm ticking a box because we've got somebody's son has come into the workplace and they're the intern for the summer. But no, we build student talent in as a part of our larger talent strategy within the organization because we can do so. And so, sort of like the eCampusOntario framework, I really do think of these accreditation criteria as some best practices that recognize the ways in which post-secondary institutions and industry and community organizations need to bend and shift their work a bit to make sure that it is actually meaningful for both parties.
So I've heard co-authorship and I've heard skin in the game from all partners as being crucial.
There's
Vikki,
a great question in the chat for Vikki,
Oh.
Justin.
Oh, yes. Terrific.
Yeah,
Thank you.
from Tanis.
Tanis, do you want to jump on the microphone and ask the question?
Sure, yeah. So Vikki, here in Canada, we're undergoing a truth and reconciliation process, which has decolonization really top of mind in terms of, what we're doing is higher education, but also the systems that are part of that as well, including the ed tech systems. And so I guess in thinking about what you described, which sounded to me like it was very much a decolonization approach, I'm wondering how that played out when it came time to find the digital platform that was going to support this, and whether that created any sort of friction, because certainly there is some evidence that it does at times. And I'm wondering too, just from the conversations that have happened today and in the various sessions around the technology piece, whether, we're going to maybe end up with a situation where, there's a need for indigenous created systems or FemEd tech created systems, or, if the actual platforms themselves don't bridge this sort of reflection that we're hearing, that's this rich reflection in this particular session, and, the part that actually delivers what we're trying to do and what the representation of that is, whether it's a colonized view of micro-credentials or a decolonized view. I mean, I hope I'm making sense here, but that's what I've been thinking about listening to the three of you, which has been really wonderful.
Mm-hmm. So Tanis, thank you for the question. I think I can speak to it a little bit, but I'm not sure that I really have a good answer. Let me just start back a little bit and talk about who our students are. So one of the ways that our work is connected to work integrated processes is that our students are recruited from the schools. So they're already in the schools as paraprofessionals, aides, coaches, language instructors. And I would say, looking at our students, 80% of them would have stayed where they were, not had the opportunity to get a baccalaureate degree if it weren't for our partnership program. And so a traditional teacher education program is one where students sit in a classroom for the most part for 3 years, and then the last year, or in our case, last 12 weeks of their program, they get a field experience, a work experience in their student teaching. And our students, and so what they say about that experience is that, oh my gosh, I learned almost everything I know about teaching from my student teaching experience. And I don't think it's really that as much as they're relearning what they learned in their classroom, but because they had no work experience to make the connection or to anchor the theory, it didn't stick. And but our students are just the opposite. They have been in the practice, and now they're learning the theory. And then throughout our program, our coursework has them in the field as much as they're in our classroom. So from the beginning of their classwork at the community college, there's teaching. And in fact, we had an opportunity through the grant to provide huge stipends to our students, but that would require them to leave their jobs. And we said, no, we really want our students to stay in their jobs, in the schools, because that will solidify that connection of theory and practice. And so they've stayed in the schools, and that also means that the people who are hiring them know what they're getting when they finish their program. And right now, we have about 30 students who would be graduating at the end of the year, and over half of them have already been hired as emergency teachers in the schools, full-time teachers, before they even get their degree. So, so that's that connection of theory and practice. So they really are able to take what they learn. They have a sense of urgency because they're non-traditional students. They have a sense of urgency to learn what they can from their classes to make them better teachers. And so the technology piece, again, I'm gonna go back a little bit. When we first started working with students in our projects, we did have online programs or hybrid programs where they're part online and part face-to-face. It was a complete disaster. We lost almost every student. So we realized that it was really important to have more of a face-to-face delivery component, and then use the platforms to support instruction. Well, then when COVID hit and we weren't able to deliver face-to-face instruction anymore, it was complete disaster. We had students who did not have internet connection. They didn't have computers. We had faculty who didn't have internet connection or computers. And so we had to quickly buy computers for our students, pay for their internet connection, make sure that our faculty were really well trained in our platform. And now in our second semester of the COVID disruption, we're using the platforms pretty well. But the community colleges have their own platforms. And so our students, it's not that they're resistant to technology, it's that their background is not really strong. And so we have a lot of work to bring them up to speed. But our students will always say that in order for them to be successful, they have to have a foot in both worlds, in their traditional Indigenous world and in the Western world. And so so they value technology as much as they value their traditional ceremonies. And they want to be successful in both worlds. So I don't know if that answers your question, Tanis, but I don't think that the technology is incompatible with where we want to go, or if we need to redesign technology to match traditional values. But I might not be the best person to answer that question.
I will just tack on, Vikki, thank you for that answer. Regarding badge platforms, so far we're not actually using any badge platforms with like a BCC and Little Bighorn College. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. We are very low tech.
Yeah, and of course it's one of those topics that I have spoken, like I spoke with, I took your advice and called the president of Little Bighorn College, Dr. Cicely Bird, and had a conversation about micro-credentials. But of course, it's always, I don't want to be, you don't want to be yet another person in a long line of people from the Western European world who is saying, hey, here's this technology that we think you might really like, right? So.
Yeah, I have a interesting example to share that comes from Lakehead University in Ontario, in Thunder Bay, and Lakehead has connected with several Indigenous bands in the North from many different communities to build a micro-credential around that is a laddering into jobs and into further education. So they've kind of said, okay, there are maybe two paths that our students or our learners will want to take, and one of them goes into a good job in the natural resources sector in Northern Ontario. So they've got partners in there, and one of them goes into potentially goes into further education at Lakehead towards a degree. And so what they've done is kind of conceived of both of those pathways and packaged them into a single micro-credential that will allow for opportunities in both of those directions. I would love to see more of that. That kind of a single credential can open up several different doors. I also have a really interesting example also from the North in Ontario of 3 different colleges working together with municipal governments in 3 different cities in the North, Sudbury, Timmins, and oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the third one, Sault Ste. Marie. And the 3 of them are working with their municipal governments up there to deal with an aging workforce. So they've got a whole bunch of people who are in the municipal government and a whole bunch of people who are aging out. And so they really want to upskill like a whole kind of section of their workforce in order to come into leadership positions. But the wonderful thing that has happened with that project is at the same time, the Indigenous governance groups have also been involved and are and they kind of were taking one direction with the curriculum, and they've widened it out to include Indigenous ways of knowing as well. And so that kind of has become the foundation on which the entire credential is built. And so you're doing 2 things. You are helping workers in municipalities in those cities to bring Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding of those cultures into their workplace. And you are also supporting Indigenous governance as well. And it's the same program, right? Like there's no point that we don't have to do 2 separate things. Like it should all be one. And so I can share those examples, but in Ontario, we're really the Northern institutions and our colleagues in the North are really leading in how they're kind of rethinking using the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action that Tanis mentioned to kind of rethink their work, with the micro-credential as kind of the vehicle for doing that. It's not the point, right? It's not the be all and end all. All of the other stuff that comes with it is the important stuff. The micro-credential is just the kind of the final product, the finished product, that is the thing that that learner can take with them in multiple directions. So, so we're really, really pleased to see what's happening there. But I'll just add that those two scenarios are not two scenarios that I could have come up with myself sitting in downtown Toronto. The only reason that that happened is because we left the door open for the people and the relationships that they were building in their local communities to come in and influence our processes in a way that made room for them to be able to explore the space in a way that made sense to them.
And Lena, would you say that it was the grant funding that was available that helped to kick off that process?
Wouldn't have, yeah, absolutely. Because so much of what's happening within our institutions is, well, especially in COVID, right? Like there's very little room for risk taking in this environment. And so our organization absorbs that risk on behalf of our institutions to allow them to kind of try something that's new, try something that's a little bit outside of the norms of their regular practice. And it's a very small amount of money. It's not a ton of money, but it is the thing that they can kind of take forward with them and say, hey, look, we've got some funding to do this. And what happens in our experience is that we only need to fund it once. Like after that, it pretty much kind of maybe twice, but after that, it probably takes, you build up some evidence, you build up some practice, and then it becomes common within that institution, and the institution takes ownership for it. And that's your sustainability model.
Well, we've only got 5 minutes left, and I just want to double check if any of you have any closing thoughts or advice for participants, or if anyone has any additional questions for our panelists. All right.
Justin, if I could, I'd just like to thank Lena and Anne-Marie for inspiring me. The work that you're doing is so where we want to go, and we've got a long ways to go in Montana. And Justin, thank you for bringing us together. I'm so impressed with the two of you and your work.
Oh, Vikki, likewise. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's just a pocket of brilliance, I think, and I hope that we can all learn from it.
I would echo that as well. We had quite a little lively prep conversation, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So thanks for bringing us all together, Justin, and moderating.
I would, Dawn here, I would encourage those of you to come over as Otago starts, because they have a very strong Indigenous support program there, and that they're actually going to do a Maori welcome. That's my understanding. So it should be very cool. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, just to echo all of you, Lena and Vikki, thank you so much for participating and for sharing your expertise and your insights. I truly appreciate it, and I've learned from just our brief interactions and talking with you. I've learned so much. So thank you very much. All right. Well, Dawn, do we want to hand the reins over to our next time zone?
Sure. And Philippe, I guess that would be your cue to stop and start streaming.
I just